Back in middle school, we were studying how the different tectonic plates moved, and each of us had to give a report on a related topic. I chose Pangaea, which was a big continent that used to exist millions of years ago, and how it broke up over time. My name is Alex, and I was always fascinated by geology and the Earth's history. I spent hours researching Pangaea and how it split apart to form the continents we know today. But little did I know, my research would lead me down a dark path. One night, as I was reading an obscure geology journal, I stumbled upon a passage that sent shivers down my spine. It talked about an ancient ritual that could supposedly reunite the tectonic plates and bring Pangaea back to life. The ritual required a series of specific movements and chants, performed at the exact location where Pangaea was said to have broken apart. Driven by my curiosity and a touch of madness, I decided to recreate the ritual. I gathered a few trusted friends and we traveled to the heart of the African continent, where Pangaea was believed to have split. We followed the instructions to the letter, performing the movements and chanting the ancient words under the full moon. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but as the night wore on, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. The earth shook violently, and we could feel the tectonic plates shifting beneath us. It was as if the ritual had worked, and Pangaea was slowly reforming. But as the shaking grew stronger, we realized the gravity of our actions. We had unleashed a force beyond our control, and the earth was tearing itself apart. The once solid ground turned to liquid, and we were swallowed by the molten rock. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. It was just a dream, but the fear lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had tampered with something I shouldn't have. I never told anyone about that night, and I never researched Pangaea again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still feel the ground trembling beneath me, and I wonder if the ritual was truly just a dream. I had my first date when I was in the 8th grade, and the girl I went with, whose name was Sarah, really liked to keep things neat and was afraid of crumbs. We decided to go to a local cafe for our date. Sarah ordered a coffee and a cookie, and I got a hot chocolate. The cafe was cozy, with warm lighting and soft music playing in the background. As Sarah bit into her cookie, a few crumbs fell onto the table. She quickly brushed them away, her eyes darting around nervously. I smiled reassuringly and said, "It's okay, Sarah, it's just a few crumbs." But as the evening went on, the crumbs seemed to multiply. Every time Sarah took a bite, more would fall onto the table. Soon the crumbs formed a small pile, and Sarah's anxiety grew. She started to fidget, her eyes darting around the cafe. I tried to distract her by talking about her favorite books and movies, but it was no use. The crumbs seemed to be taking on a life of their own, growing and spreading across the table. Sarah's breathing became shallow, and her eyes were wide with fear. Suddenly, the lights in the cafe flickered, and the music stopped. The room grew cold, and the air felt heavy. Sarah let out a small cry, and I reached for her hand, but as I touched her, I realized that her skin was icy cold. The crumbs on the table began to move, forming into a shape. It was a face, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. The face opened its mouth, and a voice whispered, "I am the crumbling cookie. I feed on neatness and order. You cannot escape me." Sarah screamed, and I pulled her up from the table. We ran out of the cafe, the crumbling cookie's laughter echoing behind us. As we ran, the crumbs on the floor seemed to chase us, growing and multiplying. We didn't stop running until we reached Sarah's house. We locked the door behind us, panting and shaking. Sarah turned to me, her eyes wide. "What was that?" she whispered. I shook my head, unable to find the words. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never look at a cookie, or think about one breaking up, the same way again. I was always mildly afraid of my aunt, who was rather strict, and didn't particularly care for it when my parents and I visited her house. I remember she liked to work on jigsaw puzzles, and once she got them together, she put that puzzle glue on them to keep them that way. God help anyone who got too close or bumped into one. One evening, while my parents were out for dinner, leaving me alone with my aunt, she decided to work on a particularly large and intricate puzzle. It was a beautiful landscape, with a dark, foreboding forest in the center. I watched from a distance as she meticulously placed each piece, her hands steady and her eyes sharp. Hours passed, and the puzzle began to take shape. As the last piece was placed, my aunt let out a satisfied sigh and reached for the puzzle glue. She carefully applied it to the back of the puzzle, ensuring that every piece was firmly stuck in place. Then, she leaned back in her chair and admired her work. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low and raspy. I nodded, not daring to speak. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. The puzzle began to tremble, and then, to my horror, it started to break apart. The pieces fell to the table, scattering like leaves in the wind. My aunt's eyes widened, and she let out a cry of disbelief. "No!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "This can't be happening." But it was happening. The puzzle was falling apart before our very eyes, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. As the last piece fell, my aunt slumped back in her chair, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What does this mean?" I whispered, my voice shaking. My aunt didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the scattered pieces, her mind racing, and then, slowly, she began to speak. It means that something is coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something dark and terrible, and it's coming for us." I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked at the broken puzzle. What did it mean, and what was coming for us? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. My aunt's fear was contagious, and it was spreading through me like a disease. As the night wore on, the feeling of dread only grew stronger, and when my parents finally returned, I couldn't help but wonder, would we ever be safe again? One time in 8th grade, we were taking a math test, and like usual, it was kicking my butt. We had to factor quadratic equations, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to break this one up. The numbers just danced on the page, mocking me with their smug little faces. "Come on, you can do this," I muttered to myself, pressing my pencil to the paper with a little more force than necessary. The lead snapped, sending tiny shards flying across my desk. Great, just what I needed. I glanced up at the clock, the second hand ticking away relentlessly. There were only 5 minutes left, and I had barely scratched the surface of the test. Panic began to creep in, tightening my chest and making it hard to breathe. "Focus," I told myself firmly. "You can do this." But as I stared at the equation, something strange began to happen. The numbers started to blur and shift, rearranging themselves into something else. It was something that made my blood run cold. 3x squared plus 13x plus 6 equals 0, the equation read. But, as I watched it, the numbers seemed to morph and twist, forming a message that sent a chill down my spine. 3x squared plus 13x plus 6 equals 666, the equation now declared, the numbers glowing with an eerie red light. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, the equation was back to normal. Had I imagined it? A sudden gust of wind blew through the open window, rustling the papers on my desk and sending a shiver down my spine. I looked around the classroom, but everyone else seemed oblivious to the strange occurrence. "Time's up," Mrs. Thompson announced, her voice cutting through the silence. "Please pass your papers to the front." I stared at my test, my hands shaking slightly. I had barely answered any of the questions, and now I was convinced that something sinister was at play. As I handed in my paper, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just glimpsed something otherworldly, something that defied the laws of mathematics and logic. I left the classroom in a daze, the numbers from the equation still dancing in my mind. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Algebra class would never be the same again. A few years ago, I decided to do more landscaping in our front yard. Unfortunately, the dirt where we live is pretty tough, and just breaking up the earth is a horror story in and of itself. It was a warm afternoon when I first started digging. The sun was beating down on my back, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my forehead. The ground was hard and unyielding, but I was determined to make a change. I picked up my shovel and began to dig. At first, it was just like any other day of hard work. The shovel hit the ground with a dull thud, and I had to use all my strength to drive it into the earth. But as I dug deeper, I started to feel something strange. The soil seemed to resist me, pushing back against my shovel as if it didn't want to be disturbed. I tried to ignore the feeling and keep digging, but the deeper I went, the more the soil seemed to fight back. It was as if it was alive, pulsing with some kind of dark energy. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, I hit something hard. It was a bone, a human bone. My heart raced as I stared at the skeletal hand protruding from the dirt. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had to keep digging. As I dug deeper, more bones emerged from the ground. They were everywhere, surrounding me on all sides. I felt like I was in a nightmare, trapped in a sea of death. And then I heard a voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder until it filled my head. "You shouldn't have disturbed us," it whispered. "Now you'll pay the price." I dropped my shovel and ran. I ran as fast as I could, away from the bone-filled pit and the voice that haunted me. I never looked back. To this day, I can still hear that voice in my dreams. And I know that if I ever try to dig in that yard again, I'll be digging my own grave.